Tony Callahan leaned back in his chair, the kitchen table creaking under his weight as he shifted. His calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, knuckles white with tension. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second feeling like an eternity. As he watched Alicia flit around the living room, getting ready for yet another night out, his jaw clenched. Alicia's lithe figure was poured into a skin-tight red dress that left little to the imagination. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back in loose curls, and her face was carefully made up, smoky eyes and ruby lips completing the look of a woman ready to paint the town red. Tony's stomach churned with a mixture of anger and disappointment. This scene had played out far too many times in recent months, and he was sick of it. He had married Alicia for her vivacious spirit, but lately, that spirit seemed more interested in partying than building a life with him. "Alicia," he called out, his voice gruff with barely contained frustration. "This is the third time this month. I told you I don't want you going to those parties with your so-called friends. There's nothing good that comes from them." Alicia barely spared him a glance, continuing to apply her lipstick in the hallway mirror. "Tony, who do you think you are? Telling me what to do? I'm a free woman. I don't need your permission." The dismissive tone in her voice made Tony's blood boil. He slammed his coffee mug down on the table, dark liquid slashing over the rim and staining the worn wood. In 3 quick strides, he was at the entrance to the hallway, his muscular frame filling the doorway. "If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "I'm serious, Alicia. I won't tolerate this anymore." Alicia whirled to face him, her eyes flashing with fury. "Who do you think you are? You don't own me. I'll do whatever I want." She snatched up her purse from the side table, the bead clutch glinting in the dim light of the hallway. Without another word, she brushed past Tony, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air. The front door slammed shut behind her, with a finality that echoed through the suddenly silent house. Tony stood there, staring at the closed door, his mind racing. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about months of neglect, of lies, of a growing distance between them that seemed insurmountable. He tried talking, he tried compromising, but nothing seemed to get through to Alicia anymore. As the initial shock of her departure wore off, a cold determination settled over Tony. He wasn't going to let this go, not this time. He needed answers, and he was going to get them tonight. Grabbing his jacket from the coat rack, Tony headed out into the cool night air. He knew where Alicia and her friends usually went, a trendy nightclub downtown that always seemed to have a line around the block. Tonight, he wasn't going there to party. He was going to find out exactly what his wife had been up to all these nights. The drive downtown was a blur of street lights and honking horns. Tony's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his mind playing out various scenarios of what he might find. None of them were good. He parked across the street from the nightclub, the pulsing beat of the music audible even from inside. The sidewalk was crowded with people waiting to get in, laughing and chatting, oblivious to the turmoil in Tony's mind. An hour crawled by, each minute feeling like an eternity. Tony's eyes scanned the crowd relentlessly, looking for any sign of Alicia. Just as he was beginning to think she might have gone somewhere else, a taxi pulled up. Tony's breath caught in his throat as he watched Alicia step out, followed by her friend. But it was the third person who emerged from the taxi that made Tony's blood run cold. Jake Donovan. Tony recognized him immediately, the smooth-talking nightclub promoter who always seemed to be hanging around Alicia and her friends. He was younger than Tony, with perfectly styled hair and the kind of easy charm that Tony had always distrusted. As Tony watched, frozen in his seat, Jake approached Alicia. There was no mistaking the familiarity between them. Alicia's arms wrapped around Jake's neck, her body pressing against his, as she laughed at something he said. Jake's hands settled on the small of her back, lower than could be considered friendly. The betrayal hit Tony like a physical blow. He had suspected, of course, the late nights, the secrecy, the growing distance between them all made sense now. But seeing it with his own eyes was something else entirely. For a moment, Tony considered storming across the street, confronting them right there in front of everyone. His hands clenched into fists, the urge to lash out almost overwhelming. But as he watched Alicia place her hand on Jake's chest, laughing up at him as they walked into the club together, a different kind of resolve settled over Tony. This wasn't going to be solved with a public confrontation. No, this required a different approach. Tony started the car, his mind already formulating a plan. He'd confront Alicia, but on his terms. Tonight, he'd seen enough. The drive home was silent, the radio off, as Tony replayed the scene in his mind over and over. By the time he pulled into the driveway, his initial shock had hardened into a cold, implacable anger. Inside the house, Tony didn't bother turning on the lights. He sat in the darkness of the living room, waiting. Hours ticked by, but he barely moved, his mind focused on what needed to be done. It was nearly 2 a.m. when he heard the sound of a key in the lock. The front door opened, and Alicia stumbled in, giggling to herself. The smell of alcohol and unfamiliar perfume wafted in with her. Tony remained seated, his voice cutting through the darkness. "Get out!" Alicia jumped, startled by his presence, fumbling for the light switch as the room was suddenly illuminated. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her words slightly slurred. Tony stood slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Your things are packed. They're outside. You won't be living here anymore." Alicia's expression shifted from amusement to shock as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. She took a step towards him, her hand reaching out. "You're throwing me out? You're serious?" Without a word, Tony walked to the front door and yanked it open. Outside, neatly stacked on the porch, were several suitcases and boxes, all of Alicia's belongings. "Go be with Jake," Tony said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You two deserve each other. And don't come back." The color drained from Alicia's face as she realized Tony knew about Jake. "Wait, Tony!" she started, panic creeping into her voice, but Tony was done listening. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not bruising, and guided her towards the door. Alicia stumbled onto the porch, her high heels catching on the welcome mat. Before she could turn around, Tony slammed the door shut. The lock clicked into place with a finality that echoed through the house. On the other side of the door, Alicia began to pound her fists against the wood. "Tony, open the door. We need to talk about this." But Tony didn't respond. He stood there, listening to her pleas and feeling nothing. The woman he had loved, the life they had built together, it all seemed like a distant memory now. As Alicia's cries grew more desperate, Tony turned and walked away from the door. He had decisions to make, a life to rebuild, and for the first time in their marriage, he was putting himself first. In the quiet of the house, Tony pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Sam, it's Tony. I need your help. I want to file for divorce." Tony sat in the sleek office of Samantha Keller, his newly hired divorce attorney. The room was all clean lines and modern furniture, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Tony's life. Samantha, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 40s, studied the file before her with laser focus. "So, Tony," she began, looking up from the papers, "you want to file for divorce immediately, no separation period, no attempts at reconciliation. Are you absolutely certain about this?" Tony nodded, his jaw tight. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Samantha leaned back in her chair, assessing him. "All right, but you should know, divorces can get ugly fast, especially when there's infidelity involved. Are you prepared for what's coming?" Tony's eyes hardened. "I'm not backing down if that's what you're asking." Alicia made her choice. Now she can live with the consequences. "Fair enough," Samantha replied, a hint of approval in her voice. "Let's get started then. I'll file the paperwork today. In the meantime, I need you to gather every piece of evidence you have of Alicia's infidelity and reckless spending. Text messages, photos, bank statements, anything and everything." Tony nodded, already mentally cataloging the damning evidence he had collected over the past months. "I'll have it all to you by tomorrow." As Tony left Samantha's office, his phone buzzed. Alicia's name flashed on the screen. He declined the call without hesitation. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, intense encounters. Tony threw himself into his work, taking on extra projects to keep his mind occupied. But the real battle was just beginning. One crisp morning, Tony found himself face to face with Alicia and her attorney, Richard Langston, in the first mediation session. The conference room felt claustrophobic, charged with an unspoken intention. Richard, a silver-haired man with a predatory smile, spoke first. "Mr. Callahan, my client is willing to be reasonable in her demands. Perhaps we can come to an amicable agreement without dragging this out." Tony's eyes flicked to Alicia, who sat with false composure, her hands clasped tightly on the table. He turned back to Richard, his voice cold. "There's nothing to discuss. Your client violated our marriage vows and squandered our shared resources. She'll get what she's legally entitled to, nothing more." Alicia's composure cracked. "Tony, please, we can work this out. I made a mistake, but a mistake." Tony cut her off, his voice sharp. "Is that what you call months of lying and cheating? Spending our savings on your parties and your new boyfriend?" Richard cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Now, Mr. Callahan, let's not make accusations without proof." Samantha interjected smoothly, pulling out a thick folder. "Oh, we have proof, Mr. Langston. Would you like to see the photos of Mrs. Callahan with her friend? Or perhaps the credit card statements showing thousands spent at clubs and hotels?" The color drained from Alicia's face as Samantha laid out document after document. Text messages, photos, bank statements, all painting a clear picture of her infidelity and reckless behavior. You were spying on me?" Alicia sputtered, her eyes wide with disbelief. Tony met her gaze unflinchingly. "I was protecting myself, and it's a good thing I did." The mediation ended in a stalemate, with Richard requesting time to review the evidence. As they left the room, Alicia grabbed Tony's arm. "We need to talk privately." Tony shook off her grip. "We have nothing to discuss." "Alicia, not anymore." Days turned into weeks as the divorce proceedings dragged on. Tony threw himself into his work, taking on bigger projects and longer hours. The construction site became his refuge, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the legal battles. One evening, as Tony was locking up the side office, he spotted a familiar figure leaning against his truck. Jake, Alicia's lover, stood there with an uneasy smile. "Hey man, can we talk?" Jake called out, his usual smooth demeanor nowhere to be seen. Tony's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice level. "There's nothing to talk about. Get lost." Jake held up his hands placatingly. "Look, I know you're pissed. You have every right to be, but Alicia, she's a mess, man. She regrets everything." Tony laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet evening. "And what, you think that makes it all okay? That I should just forgive and forget?" "No." Jake started to speak, but Tony cut him off. "Let me make this clear," Tony said, stepping closer, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't care about Alicia's regrets. I don't care about your guilt. You two made your choices, now you get to live with them. And if I see you around here again, you'll regret it. Understood?" Jake swallowed hard, nodding quickly before retreating to his car. Tony watched him drive away, a mixture of anger and disgust churning in his gut. The next day, Tony sat in the courtroom, listening as Alicia's attorney painted a picture of emotional neglect and cold indifference. Richard's voice dripped with false sympathy as he described Alicia as a lonely, misunderstood wife driven to seek comfort elsewhere. "Your Honor," Richard concluded, "my client simply asks for what she's entitled to, her fair share of the marital assets, including the house and Mr. Callahan's retirement fund. It's a fair division given the circumstances." The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, turned to Samantha. "Miss Keller, your response?" Samantha stood, her posture confident. "Your Honor, while Mr. Langston's story is certainly dramatic, it is far from the truth. We have evidence that paints a very different picture." Over the next hour, Samantha methodically presented the evidence Tony had gathered. Photos of Jake, time-stamped text messages detailing their affair, bank statements showing Alicia's extravagant spending. As you can see, Your Honor, Samantha concluded, Mrs. Callahan's infidelity and financial irresponsibility are well documented. She violated not only her marriage vows but also her fiduciary duty to the marital estate. We ask that this be taken into consideration when dividing assets. The judge's expression remained impassive as she reviewed the evidence. I'll need time to review all of this thoroughly. We'll reconvene next week for my decision. As they left the courtroom, Tony caught sight of Alicia huddled with her attorney, her face pale and drawn. For a moment, he felt a twinge of something, not quite pity, but a recognition of how far they'd fallen. The week dragged by, each day feeling longer than the last. Tony buried himself in work, staying late at the construction site, going over plans and budgets long after everyone else had gone home. Finally, the day of the judge's decision arrived. Tony sat straight-backed in the courtroom, his face a mask of calm. Across the aisle, Alicia fidgeted nervously, her eyes darting between Tony and the judge's bench. The judge entered, her face serious as she took her seat. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, I'm ready to deliver my ruling, she said. Tony held his breath, acutely aware of Alicia doing the same across the aisle. In the matter of the division of assets, the judge continued, I find in favor of Mr. Callahan. Mrs. Callahan's documented infidelity and financial irresponsibility have significantly impacted the marital estate. Therefore, the house and the majority of shared assets will remain with Mr. Callahan. Mrs. Callahan will retain her personal belongings and a small portion of the savings account. A gasp escaped Tony's lips, quickly stifled. Tony remained still, his expression unchanged. Furthermore, the judge added, given Mrs. Callahan's current unemployment and the circumstances of the divorce, no alimony will be awarded. This decision is final. Court is adjourned. The bang of the gavel echoed through the courtroom. Tony stood, shaking Samantha's hand firmly. Thank you, he said simply as they turned to leave. Alicia rushed over, her eyes wild. Tony, please, you can't do this to me. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do? Tony looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in months. The woman he had loved was barely recognizable in the desperate figure before him. You'll do what you always do, Alicia, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. You'll figure it out, but you'll do it without me. With that, Tony walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind the shattered remains of his marriage and the woman who had broken his trust. As he stepped into the sunlight streamed in as he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The battle was over. He had won. But as he drove home to the house that was now indisputably his, Tony knew that the real challenge lay ahead. Rebuilding his life, learning to trust again, and figuring out who he was outside of his failed marriage wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long time, Tony felt ready to face whatever came next. Tony stood at the threshold of his home, key in hand, staring at the front door. The house loomed before him, quiet and still. For the first time in months, he knew he wouldn't find Alicia inside. He wouldn't have to brace himself for another argument or endure the tense silence that had become their norm. He pushed the door open, the familiar creak of hinges echoing through the empty space. The living room was bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, dust motes dancing in the light. Tony's footsteps echoed as he made his way to the kitchen, each sound a reminder of his solitude. Opening the fridge, he grabbed a bottle of beer, twisting off the cap with a practiced motion. He walked to the back porch, settling into his favorite chair. The wood creaked under his weight as he leaned back, taking a long swig of the cold beer. As the sky darkened, painting the horizon in shades of orange and purple, Tony let out a deep breath. The weight of the past year seemed to lift off his shoulders with each passing moment. The silence, which once felt oppressive, now felt like peace. No more games, Tony muttered to himself, raising his bottle in a solitary toast. He took another sip, savoring the bitter taste. His mind wandered to the future, stretching out before him. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of possibility, of potential untapped. The sound of his phone ringing broke through his reverie. Tony glanced at the screen, seeing his friend Mark's name flash. "Hey, Mark," Tony answered, his voice gruff from disuse. "Tony, my man." Mark's voice boomed through the speaker. "Heard the news. The divorce is final." "Huh?" Tony grunted in affirmation. "Yeah, it's done. Listen, Mark," continued his friend, his tone softening slightly. "A bunch of us are heading out for drinks. Why don't you join us? Celebrate your freedom." Tony hesitated. The invitation stirred a mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to stay in his solitude to process everything that had happened. But another part, a part he hadn't listened to in a long time, urged him to accept. "You know what, Tony?" he said, surprising himself. "I think I will. Text me the address." An hour later, Tony found himself in a dimly lit bar, surrounded by the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. Mark clapped him on the back as he approached the table where his friends were gathered. "There he is," Mark exclaimed, raising his glass to Tony. "A free man at last." The others at the table cheered, lifting their drinks in a toast. Tony felt a small smile tug at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine one in what felt like ages. As the night wore on, Tony found himself relaxing, the tension of the past months slowly ebbing away. His friends, sensing his mood, kept the conversation light, sharing jokes and stories that had nothing to do with failed marriages or bitter divorces. It was nearing midnight when Sarah, one of his co-workers, leaned close to be heard over the noise of the bar. "So, Tony," she said, her eyes curious but kind, "what's next for you? Any big plans now that you're single?" Tony paused, considering the question. It was something he'd been avoiding thinking about. But now, with the alcohol warming his veins and the supportive presence of his friends around him, he felt ready to face it. "You know," he said slowly, "I think I'm going to focus on work for a while. There's that big project coming up, the one for the new community center. I've been thinking about some ideas to really make it special." Sarah's eyes lit up. "Oh yeah, like what?" As Tony began to explain his ideas, he felt a spark of excitement ignite within him. The more he talked, the more enthusiastic he became, his hands gesturing animatedly as he described his vision. Mark, overhearing the conversation, chimed in. "Sounds like you've got it all figured out, Tony, but don't forget to have some fun too. All work and no play, you know." Tony chuckled, a warm, genuine sound that surprised even him. Yeah, I hear you. Maybe I'll even take that fishing trip we've been talking about for years." The night ended on a high note with promises to meet up again soon. As Tony climbed into a taxi, he felt lighter than he had in months. The future, which had seemed so bleak just a short time ago, now held promise. The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of activity. Tony threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, his ideas for the community center project gaining traction with both his team and the clients. One sunny afternoon, as Tony stood on the construction site, hard hat in place and blueprints in hand, he heard a familiar voice call out to him. "Mr. Callahan, do you have a moment?" Tony turned to see Richard Langston, Alicia's former attorney, approaching. The sight of the man sent a jolt of tension through Tony's body, memories of the bitter court battles flooding back. "Mr. Langston," Tony acknowledged, his voice cool. "What can I do for you?" Richard shifted uncomfortably, clearly ill at ease in the dusty construction site. I wanted to apologize, Mr. Callahan, for everything that happened during the divorce proceedings. It was unprofessional of me to push things as far as I did." Tony studied the man, noting the signs of stress etched on his face. "That's what you were paid to do, wasn't it? Push things as far as you could." Richard nodded, a ruthless expression crossing his face. "Yes, but well, let's just say I've had some time to reflect on my methods. Your ex-wife. She wasn't entirely truthful with me about the circumstances of your marriage." Tony's jaw clenched at the mention of Alicia. "Is that so?" Richard continued, his voice low. "She's been struggling since the divorce, tried to file a complaint against me with the Bar Association, claiming I mishandled her case. It didn't go anywhere, of course, but it made me realize some things." Tony remained silent, waiting for Richard to get to the point. "Anyway," Richard said, clearing his throat, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. And well, I admire how you handled yourself throughout the whole ordeal. It couldn't have been easy. Tony considered the man's words, feeling the last vestiges of anger towards him fade away. Thank you, Mr. Langston. I appreciate you saying that. As Richard walked away, Tony turned back to his blueprints, his mind already refocusing on the task at hand. The encounter, brief as it was, felt like the closing of a chapter. Weeks turned into months, and Tony found himself settling into a new rhythm. His days were filled with work, his evenings with a mix of quiet solitude and occasional outings with friends. The house, once a reminder of his failed marriage, slowly became a sanctuary. One crisp fall evening, as Tony was leaving his office, he ran into Sarah in the parking lot. "Hey, Tony," she called out, waving. "Headed home?" Tony nodded, offering a small smile. "Yeah, thought I'd call it a day." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then seemed to make up her mind about something. "Actually, I was wondering if you'd like to grab dinner. There's this new Italian place I've been wanting to try." Tony blinked, caught off guard by the invitation. He studied Sarah's face, noting the hint of nervousness in her eyes. For a brief moment, he felt a flicker of panic, old fears and doubts threatening to surface. But then he took a deep breath, pushing those feelings aside. This wasn't Alicia. This was Sarah, someone he'd known and respected for years, someone who had been there for him during the darkest days of his divorce. "You know what?" Tony said, surprised by the warmth in his own voice. "That sounds great. Lead the way." As they walked to Sarah's car, chatting easily about work and mutual friends, Tony felt a sense of possibility unfurling within him. He wasn't ready for another serious relationship. Not yet, but friendship, companionship, those were things he could embrace. The Italian restaurant was cozy and warm, the smell of garlic and tomato sauce filling the air as they settled into their seats. Tony found himself relaxing, the conversation flowing easily. "So, Sarah," she said, taking a sip of her wine, "I heard the community center project is really taking off. The designs looked amazing in the last meeting." Tony nodded, a spark of pride igniting in his chest. "Yeah, it's coming along well. We got some great ideas for making it really functional for the neighborhood, energy efficient too." As he began to elaborate on the plans, Tony felt that familiar excitement building. He described the solar panels they were incorporating, the community garden space, the multipurpose rooms designed to host everything from job training to our classes. Sarah listened intently, her eyes bright with interest. "Tony, that's incredible. You've really poured yourself into this project, haven't you?" Tony paused, considering her words. "I guess I have," he said slowly. "After everything that happened, well, it felt good to focus on creating something positive, you know?" Sarah reached across the table, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "I think it's wonderful. You should be proud of yourself, Tony, not just for the project, but for how you've handled everything this past year." Tony felt a warmth spread through him at her words, a feeling that had nothing to do with the wine they were drinking. "Thanks, Sarah. That means a lot." As they finished their meal and stepped out into the cool night air, Tony felt a sense of contentment wash over him. The future, which had once seemed so uncertain, now felt full of promise. "This was nice," he said, turning to Sarah. "We should do it again sometime." Sarah smiled, her eyes twinkling in the streetlight. "I like that, Tony. I like that a lot." As Tony drove home that night, he found himself humming along to the radio, a habit he had all but forgotten in the stress of the past year. The house, when he pulled into the driveway, didn't loom over him as it once had. Instead, it felt like a welcome sight, a place of peace and possibility. Stepping inside, Tony kicked off his shoes and made his way to the back porch. He settled into his favorite chair, looking out over the backyard. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow over the landscape. Tony took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. The anger that had fueled him for so long, the bitterness over Alicia's betrayal, the stress of the divorce, it all seemed to have lost its edge. In its place was a quiet strength, a resolve to move forward. He thought about the community center project, about the difference it would make in people's lives. He thought about his friends who had stood by him through the darkest times, and he thought about Sarah, about the warmth of her smile and the possibility of new beginnings. Tony wasn't naive. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and difficulty. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face them. He had weathered the storm of his failed marriage and come out stronger on the other side. As the night deepened around him, Tony allowed himself a small smile. The past was behind him now, a chapter closed. The future, with all its uncertainties and possibilities, stretched out before him. And Tony Callahan was ready to embrace it, one day at a time.